Okay, today's episode of Ivory GC, Eric Topel. Eric, how are you?
I'm doing well, Brian. Yourself?
Doing well. Doing well. Thanks for coming on. I think we're at episode 5 here, so still pretty new and bold of our guests to join us here. So I thank you for taking the time. Looking forward to talking about your story, your experience, and yeah, I think it's going to be a really good conversation.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Eric, why don't we start by going through what your background, your experience as a lawyer. I'll give us the kind of high level overview, and then we'll dive into some topics as we go.
Sure, happy to. So thanks, Brian. So Eric Topel, I'm currently the global general counsel for a company called PatSnap, which is headquartered in Singapore, has a strong presence in Asia as well as EMEA and North America, and we have a leading patent analytics and innovation intelligence platform. So our products are really targeted for R&D folks, IP professionals, and patent attorneys to really help ensure that they're investing in products that ultimately could be invented and taken to market and protected without infringing. I've been with PatSnap for about 7 months. I started in April. And so my responsibilities, I'm overseeing the legal team globally, as well as the Western security and IT function. And by Western, meaning Singapore, Japan, EMEA, and North America. I started my career quite a few years ago in big law. I started with Proskauer Rose and then with Epstein, Becker, and Green, where I was a labor and employment and commercial litigator and advisor. I was worked at the law firms, I think collectively for between 7 and 8 years, but I always knew that I ultimately wanted to move in-house. And so I first moved in-house in the CPG space with a company called Danone, which many of you may understand to be the parent for Danone yogurt, Evian water, Happy Family baby food, and Silk almond milk, amongst others. And I was there for almost 8 years, wore a lot of different hats, but it really afforded me that opportunity to expand outside of litigation and labor and employment into other areas and to really integrate deeply into the business. And so during my time there, I worked very closely with the sales organization in developing the go-to-market strategy, negotiating many of the commercial agreements, distribution agreements, etc. I got very involved in corporate governance. And so during my time there, we converted Danone North America to a public benefit corporation, and we became B Corp certified. I got involved in some M&A, both at the due diligence phase, but more intimately involved in the post-merger integration process. And so I've seen what good integration looks like. Was also involved in a lot of compliance initiatives, especially when it came to FCPA and anti-competition. And I spent my last 2 years or so at Danone as the general counsel for their U.S. water subsidiary, so selling Evian in the U.S. And that was really my first foray into being a GC, being on the C-suite of an organization, and really in being involved at like a very high strategic level beyond just the day-to-day. And so not only to understand the financial fundamentals, but how to grow a business, how to do it the right way in a way that's sustainable, being mindful of not only top line, but also OpEx, and really being involved in not only serving as a counselor to the other leadership team members, but also how to make kind of company-wide decisions. And so I'm really proud during my time there, we made a lot of fundamental changes and ultimately grew the company 3x. I was there, as I said, almost 8 years, was very content, but I was recruited by a company called UiPath. UiPath was a tech startup in the robotic process automation space, so helping companies automate a lot of digital processes at a very enterprise level. It was founded in Romania, and this was in 2018. They were pivoting to make the US their global headquarters. At the time, they had about 1,800 people globally, They just completed their Series C financing round at a $3 billion valuation. And the goal was to build out the US corporate infrastructure so that one day it could be in a position to potentially IPO. And that was my first opportunity to work in the tech space, to work in a startup environment, and I really enjoyed it. It started during my time with Danone Waters and continued to UiPath. I very much have that entrepreneurial spirit. I love to roll up my sleeves, work closely with the business to help grow in a profitable, sustainable way. I don't view legal as a mere cost center. I view us as a critical partner to the business. And I got to really expand my traditional corporate law background. So I was even more involved in M&A. I got very involved in negotiating commercial SaaS agreements. I got a lot of experience helping to manage our equity program and to develop a new stock plan, to transition to a new equity platform, to help develop an employee stock purchase program. And at the time, we were approaching 40 countries. So there's all the tax elements that come with that. Was involved in litigation. I got very involved in data privacy and was serving as our HIPAA compliance officer. So really continued to round out the experience that I had at Danone. And I spent the last 2 years at UiPath preparing the company to go public. And so I was on the core team that helped it to ultimately IPO in April 2021. Everything from choosing Counsel to represent the company as well as the underwriters, drafting the S1, developing a lot of the public company policies, processes, trainings, board committee charters, helping to diversify the board of directors. I got involved in ESG initiatives, and then ultimately we went public, and I continued on as we operate as a public company, getting some exposure more to the traditional SEC regulations. Again, it was a great 3.5 years there. And then I got a call from a company called Secure that recruited me to join as their senior director. Soon after joining, I became their associate general counsel. They were in the digital identity validation and fraud prevention space. And it was just, again, at the time I left UiPath, it had about 4,000 people in 40 countries. And so Secure was probably 500 people, primarily in the US, with about 20% in India. And it was just another opportunity to be even that much closer to not only the GC, certainly, but the C-suite and the board, and to even further gain experience in some of the other areas. And so during my time in Secure, I oversaw all corporate and litigation activities. So I spearheaded in about a $70 million M&A deal, and then the post-merger integration. I was involved in financing. I was involved in securing a significant line of credit. This was around the time of like the Silicon Valley Bank, et cetera. So that was really important. And also just in helping them run the company on a day-to-day perspective, litigation, labor and employment, equity, due diligence on other potential acquisitions, and really just to help mature the organization, again, with the goal of one day going public. I was there for 2 years, had a great relationship with the GC, with the CFO, with the C-suite, and it just so happened that PatSnap called, and it was an opportunity to be the general counsel and to really help kind of drive the ship. And so it was a logical next step for me.
There's so much there to dive into. It's one thing that I pick up on as we're talking through your experiences, you start small, grow it big, right? Then start at the next company, start a little small, grow it big, and get a little bit higher up in the organization. So you've done a lot. Your career has progressed in I think an amazingly sensical manner. You don't always see that, right? I mean, or people kind of jump around a bunch, and you're obviously very strategic with your career path, which is really impressive. A few things to jump into there. I mean, IPO preparedness, one, certainly. Pre and post merger tasks and integration, I think would be really interesting to talk about. Why don't we start more kind of closer to the beginning? where you were the US GC for a sub of Danone. At that time, I mean, what were some of the things that you started learning about being a GC, working with the executive team? I mean, that was really it seems like your first opportunity to go from boots on the ground, negotiating and overseeing commercial matters to more of a leadership role where you had a chance to guide, the direction of the company. What did you learn early on in that experience?
Sure. So I think first is very much cultivating a strong and trusting relationship with the other leaders, in particular, whether it's the CEO or the general manager, so that they can look to you, especially when it comes to legal, regulatory, or other business matters, as a trusted counselor. I think certainly as you move up kind of the chain, you need to be a little bit more strategic. You need to delegate more and be a little bit less in the weeds, while also understanding at the end of the day, you're accountable for what happens.
Yeah.
And so I'm a big believer in trying to develop the talent that you have without micromanaging, and to really help people set them up for success. Obviously, to be there to protect them if mistakes are made, which will happen, but also to be able then to provide that constructive feedback. I think certainly being on the executive team, I got intimately knowledgeable about the financial side of the business, which in legal is not always the case. And so it was a tremendous opportunity, not only for my own edification, but also just to understand what's important, what metrics we were using. I think it was also very insightful to see what success looks like and what a bad executive team looks like, whether it's from ways of working, culture, lack of trust, toxicity. And I'm not suggesting that existed there, but when I joined Danone Waters, the business was in significant decline for a host of reasons. And so I joined along with several other leaders and a new GM, and we were pretty much tasked with kind of stripping it down and rebuilding just the entire business model, which is painful. You have to make some hard decisions, which sometimes involves impacting people. And so that's not lost on me. But ultimately, for the greater good, for the health of the business, it had to happen. And then you see the rewards when it's successful. And there might be various ebbs and flows. And using this in particular example, we pretty much rewrote our distribution model, going from like a national distribution to more localized, setting up agreements all over the place, understanding that might change. So we built in rights to terminate for convenience, etc. And then towards the end of my tenure there, we ultimately decided to partner with another national distribution network. And so we went from national to more local. And then just when we had everything up and running, we had to kind of disassemble it and go national again, which was really interesting, a lot of work. But again, I view myself as a very pragmatic business partner and legal counselor. And so you need to be flexible. You need to be somewhat calm and composed and not get too high with the highs and too lows with the lows, because no matter what business you're in, it's going to ebb and flow.
So when you were at Danone as the US GC for Danone Waters, how many folks were on the US legal team at that point? Do you remember?
So the way we operated at Danone is our legal team supported all of the North American entities. So even though I was on the leadership team for the water business, I still had accountability in particular subject areas to support all of, in particular, the US businesses, as well as Southern Canada. And so the legal team, it was kind of legal and regulatory together. And we also oversaw compliance. So we probably had, I think in the US, maybe 10 attorneys, and then we work closely with some of the global teams. Like, so for example, M&A was driven mostly out of the headquarters in Paris. So we didn't have like corp dev team in the US, for example.
Got it. And Talk a little bit about the post-merger activities. I mean, you were exposed to that first at Danone, and then that came up again at other points of your career. Can you talk a bit about some of the deal details and what you had to do to successfully navigate those post-merger activities?
Sure. Both at my time at Danone and subsequently at UiPath and Secure, where we've done M&A. So there's obviously the due diligence at the outset, just to understand what is it we're trying to accomplish, what's the purpose behind this acquisition, and to work closely with the C-suite and the finance team to understand why this is strategically important and how we can best protect the company. And so it's obviously you're working closely with both internal and external counsel. You're doing the due diligence to learn as much of the business as possible, to really what are the skeletons in the closet, what litigation exposure may you have there. And so,
Eric,
and then
do you recall how you split up the due diligence with your external counsel partners? It's interesting. I started doing M&A work at the beginning of my career, and I don't know if we did much partnering, at least at with most of the deals that we were doing, much partnering with the internal legal teams to do the due diligence. How did you manage kind of splitting that up among your internal team and your external partners?
So I think it really depends on the size of the deal, the timing, how long you have, the level of risk involved. So focusing more on my time at Secure, where I was even more intimately involved, we were acquiring, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't a huge company, may have had 30 to 40 people, not a significant amount of revenue, but it was more about acquiring their particular IP and being able to integrate it. So in that case, obviously, a lot of the focus was on the intellectual property. What is it? How does it work? What do they own it? Are there any regulatory concerns? In this particular one, there was like a pending class action, so we needed to understand a little bit more about that, because if we integrated that software into our platform, what exposure is that creating, and how can we remediate that before we commingle? Obviously, it's assessing the organization, who are the people, and where do we have a need, and what makes sense. Obviously, there's the financial component, both the cash and the equity. As far as the due diligence itself, in that particular case, it was a combination of both. So when it came to the IP, we handled more of the due diligence internally with a few select R&D folks. And the reason it was select is because if it didn't go forward, we didn't want to prevent other R&D people from developing comparable software. So you had kind of like your white room, so to speak, to kind of block people off. On the commercial contracts, just because of the volume and the timing, it was a collective effort between internal and external, just to look high level. Obviously, the external spent more time on the actual transaction documents and preparing those, and we would review those and provide our comments and help negotiate the deal points. And then obviously looking at, again, the IP portfolio, that was probably a little bit more on the external. So I think it depends.
And were you using, I mean, the tail end of my time at Nixon Peabody, we were starting to use some contract review tools, eBrevia, Kira, to try to get through that due diligence contract review portion of the process much more efficiently. Were you exposed to any of those tools at Danone, or was it? I remember when I first was reviewing contracts for due diligence, it was, get a 3-inch binder full of contracts, flip page by page if I needed to, and summarize the contracts in a contract summary chart. A good way to get exposure to contracts, not the best way to probably most efficiently, cost effectively do the work. But what was your exposure to in the due diligence process to those types of tools and processes?
So both Danone and even more so at Secure, we did not use an automated tool. I mean, I
Yeah.
think my time during Danone, it was just starting to come into the market. At Secure, yeah, there certainly was some kind of automated tools and even maybe some AI, but we didn't once if you don't already have it set up, it's hard just to
Yeah.
throw it in and start using it.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely it makes sense for a law firm to integrate that if they do, the deal volume is just higher for a law firm than for the company, typically, I would think. So okay, and then go through the due diligence process, post-merger activities. What did you learn from your times both at Danone and Secure with how to successfully integrate the target company in your operations? What was your exposure to that, and what would you learn from the experience?
I learned a lot. Again, I've seen good integrations and I've seen not so strong integrations. And so I think one is really understanding what are the culture of the two companies that you're
Yeah.
combining, because sometimes you could have two really great companies with two unique cultures, and then when you merge them, if it's not done thoughtfully, you have one bad culture. Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that leads obviously to attrition and just lower morale, and you don't necessarily reap all the rewards that you intended through the integration. I
So
think,
how did you drill down into or get a good understanding of the target company's culture? What were the types of things? I mean, is it obviously in-person meetings and things of that nature, but what else would you do?
yeah, so I think it's at least in the case of Secure, and it was kind of smaller. It was meeting the people, meeting leadership, interviewing
Yeah.
the employees,
Yeah.
getting a sense.
Yeah.
Obviously, if it's a very large, um, just to give you an example, Danone, we had a few smaller acquisitions where we were the acquirer and we fully absorbed the company. And then it's just a matter of sometimes you can leave them to stand alone and operate. You'll still book the revenue, but operationally they're somewhat alone for a while. Although in legal, that often we were one of the first to go in to offer like a shared service, because a lot of times the smaller
Right.
companies, they don't have a legal team. And so right out of the gate, you can cut off the spend on external counsel, and ultimately any exposure and liability is now part of the parent. And so
Right.
we wanted to be ahead of it. But operationally would often leave things alone. Towards the end of my time there was a massive acquisition for Danone that was again spearheaded at Paris. And in the US, you had it was headquartered in like New York, and it was acquiring another large company out in the Midwest. Um, and although Danone was acquiring the company, just given the sheer size in the US, it felt more like a merger, or even that Danone was being somewhat acquired. And so and it was two very different cultures. And
Yeah.
they both had their pros and cons and were successful in their own right. And so that one was challenging because you have cultural differences, you have a certain level of insecurity because you have a lot of redundancy and
Yeah.
of jobs, and so people are vying for particular roles. And
And I
so
imagine there were
it's
there were legal teams in both organizations.
you
So
had
maybe
you had two
yeah.
of everything. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so it's now in some cases you could blend it, and in others you didn't need two of a particular role. And so somebody would remain and you have hurt feelings and somebody wouldn't.
Yeah.
So but I did get to see just how important it is to really think about how you want to integrate depending on what's important to the business. Some companies may not care about culture, and if they get it's purely transactional, and if it modifies the culture and people leave, that's okay as long as they get the asset and kind of the
Right.
can recoup what they spent through cost savings, etc. In some other places, there's more value placed on the culture. And so
Yeah.
again, I think it depends on who's where the leverage is at, and
Yeah.
And also what's going to be the role of the leaders from the company you're acquiring in the new company, because that also sets a certain tone to the people that are joining you.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, so when you let's talk about your time at UiPath a bit. So that company, you were at UiPath for how many years, Eric? Or was it 7 or 8?
I was at UiPath. No, I was at Danone for 7 to 8. I was at UiPath for
Okay.
3.5 years.
Okay.
And yeah, I know on the M&A we did at UiPath was a little bit more. It wasn't massive. We had a few deals that I was involved in, mostly in Europe. Some were more like acqui-hires, where you were really looking just to get the people. Others were more about the IP. UiPath really grew organically, kind of through like a land and expand of just like massive growth and hiring, getting
What
boots on
business
the
were
street.
they in?
I'm sorry?
What was UiPath's business?
They were an RPA, robotic process automation.
Okay. Got
And
it. Got
so when I
it.
was at UiPath, it was during the time of cash was cheap, grow at all costs. We weren't as concerned about profitability. And I think that was a really focusing on kind of the IPO topic. I think that was that was very educational for a lot of areas. So one
Yeah.
is, and what I would tell other people or CEOs or founders who their goal is, or their pitch is, come join us, we want to IPO, is the IPO is, it could be the destination, but it shouldn't necessarily drive all your decision making,
Yeah.
because you might make decisions that are not in the best interest of the business. And so I think if you mature the right way, in a way that there's line of sight to profitability and sustainability, at the end of the day, you'll have opportunities. You'll have choices, whether that's to go public or not. If you're a private company, there's some benefits because you don't have the same, regulatory oversight. You don't have as many external investors. Obviously, you want to hit your number at the end of each quarter, but it's not the end all be all. If you're a public company, it's a big deal when you don't hit your number. And there's a lot more SEC forms and regulations, and you need a lot more internal control. So, no, it's very cool, don't get me wrong, to IPO, and the company brings in a lot of cash, and they're, it's nice for investors and shareholders to get liquidity. But you just want to make sure you do it at the right cadence and at the right approach. And using UiPath as an example, when I joined, we were growing tremendously fast. And to kind of keep up with that demand, we hired a lot. And so I joined right after Series C. A few months later, we did a Series D, and just the valuations were getting quite high. We were growing very quickly. We were bringing in a lot of personnel that you would bring in if you were going to go public. The problem is it might have been a little premature, and so we suddenly were overweighted in our spend and headcount versus our revenue. And so our cash burn was not healthy. And so this was in 2018 and 2019. And so as a consequence, we had to kind of pump the brakes and kind of reset what we were spending on. The amazing holiday parties were no more. We had to restructure, reduce some headcount, and kind of bring it back down, slow it down, kind of reset. And we did that, and obviously it's not a fun experience to go through. And it certainly impacts morale, because if the carrot that you're holding out for people dangling is that IPO, and suddenly you like slam the brakes, it impacts people.
Were you on the leadership team at UiPath? Run me what your title was when you started and how it progressed over time.
So at UiPath, I was a director in the legal team. I was on the legal leadership team. I was not in the global executive team, but I worked closely with our general counsel as well as the C-suite and the board members on particular matters. And so But yeah, going back to kind of the, so we kind of pumped the brakes to get our cash burn in check. We became leaner, and we started to kind of pick up steam again. And then COVID happened, and no one knew what that would mean for the business. And in the case of UiPath, it actually accelerated growth by, when you have fewer people and you have automation, it was very appealing to enterprise customers. And we also, I think, had found the right go-to-market strategy and partners, et cetera. And so in the summer of 2020, it was like back into IPO mode, full throttle.
Right.
And so it was a very accelerated, 10 months of getting.
So when those decisions were made at the company leadership level around pivoting, slowing down on the expenditures, try to right size the company, how did that impact your role in the legal leadership team? I mean, I would imagine you're getting messages from your general counsel on kind of how the boat needs to redirect a bit. What was it like trying to implement that high level strategic guidance from the company, and how were you able to execute the strategic direction?
So, I mean, unfortunately, the first exercise was I had to put on my labor and employment hat and be involved in some of the right sizing, which is not fun, to make sure that you're achieving the cost savings and the reduction of headcount. But also, I'm a big proponent of treating people with respect as part of the transition, so that they land on their feet, not only from a social perspective, but from a PR and litigation perspective. If people aren't furious at the company when they let go, and if you do it the right way, they're not running the glass door, they're not tarnishing the company's reputation, and they're not suing you. So there was certainly that. I think we had to be more thoughtful as to, and this was across all departments, how to do more with less. And I think when you do that, you realize actually we probably were carrying more people or resources than we needed. And I think you saw that across the board at a lot of tech companies during that time period. There was obviously a lot more focus on profitability versus growing at any expense. And so you had to think twice before you procured that new system. Or how many licenses do we really need? Where can we save money? And so it's just a different mindset. And as a consequence, because you're operating a little bit more lean, you get the opportunity to get involved in more things, because out of
gotta wear some more hats to pick up on the ground. And put on from those that were left behind.
It's also, I mean, during my time at UiPath was tremendous from a development perspective. Not only working with people in all these different countries and making sure we're compliant, and just from a ways of working perspective, again, seeing the real ebbs and flows in that environment and trying to maintain an even keel. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. Making sure, okay, what are the objectives of the business? How can I, in legal or compliance, how can we help them get to where they need to go, while also making sure we're doing it in a way that's compliant and sustainable, and that we're being, how can we help turn around contract reviews more quickly and result in less friction, negotiation time, and more revenue? Does that mean you need a new CLM or a system, or can you just streamline your templates? Can you adjust the playbooks and kind of your risk tolerance? So it was a really interesting time. And you just have to be, again, flexible and pivot and be open to change, because during my time at UiPath in 3.5 years, I think we had 3 or 4 CROs, a few CFOs, a couple of GCs. And so just when you're getting comfortable and developing that rapport, someone new comes in and you have to start over and again develop that rapport, which if you like the person, if you have a good working relationship, could be frustrating or challenging, but that's just par for the course. I think with a lot of these startups, as they move into quasi-startup and more mature company, it's a different talent profile. The head of sales who gets you to 100 million is not necessarily the one who can get you to 200, who can take you to $1 billion. And so, and that's another challenge as these companies grow, is resetting the rules of engagement, resetting what's expected and how people are accountable. Because again, what you get away with when it's 10 people in an apartment where there's no rules or process, to suddenly you trying to put in place some structure, not everyone likes.
Right. So Eric, on the IPO preparedness piece, talk a little bit about how that process started at UiPath, what your involvement was, and really what you learned from that experience.
So I was involved from the very beginning to, doing the roadshow with 3 or 4 law firms, understanding, because you're not just choosing on the company side, you're not just choosing who represents you in the IPO. In all likelihood, that's going to be your corporate law firm going forward. And so you want to not just be comfortable with the IPO attorney, but the larger team in their ecosystem.
So is that a new outside counsel engagement for you, when you started the IPO preparedness process?
It doesn't have to be. In our case, it was. We had the VC kind of law firm. And then it was decided for IPO, we would go with a larger firm with more experience in that space, who has the relationships at the SEC and with the banks. And so we did that, and we ultimately chose the law firms to represent us and the underwriters. Obviously, even before that, you have to kind of assess what sort of listing do you want? Do you want, in the US, do you want New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, or do you want direct listing, or, SPACs when they were, all the rage? So, so once we kind of had the law firms, then there's a lot of just parallel activities. There's the due diligence. A lot of the heavy lifting, frankly, in the beginning is more on the finance and internal controls side. On the legal side, it's obviously making sure that our data room is populated with all the information and corporate documents that the underwriters and investors are going to want to know about, and what you're going to need to disclose. I'm sorry?
I was just going to ask you about your process for building your internal data room, because I know that's something that a lot of companies are thinking about, whether it's preparing for an IPO or getting ready to sell. How did you at UiPath start building the data room? When did you start doing it? What worked? What didn't work? Things like that.
Well, so fortunately, we had been involved in a number of financing rounds, so we weren't starting from zero. We had a lot of the materials to gather. A lot of it was just figuring out what we didn't have, or there's some things you might need to disclose in the S1 that maybe weren't as important in due diligence, particular terms in some of the commercial contracts, for example. What is the current litigation? What's ongoing. Obviously, you work closely with the executive team. You need to diversify your directors. Up to that point, it's more probably VC backed, and you need some independence and people with the appropriate financial acumen, and in some cases, more diversity demographically. And then you also need to put in place, make sure you have an audit committee and kind of a nominating and governance committee and a compensation committee, and that each one has a charter. You need
so
to
all
develop...
of that is taking shape during the preparedness process. I mean, you're really putting those in place so that when you're a public company,
there's kind of a schedule. It doesn't all happen right at one time.
Sure.
There's developing a lot of public company policies that you may not have had. Insider trading, for example. There's training and education that goes on with your employee base, because at some point you need to make clear to everyone, like, no one can talk about this. Up until a certain point, salespeople might be pitching a future IPO as part of their sales enablement. At some point, you cannot do that, or there's serious consequences. Working closely with finance and tax, we had to develop a new stock plan, and we wanted to put in place an employee stock purchase program, and making sure we transitioned to a new equity platform.
Do you remember how long that process took from decisions that we're gonna pursue in earnest the IPO process to IPO?
So I think on the finance side, some of it may have started a little bit earlier. But I feel like we really started in the summer of 2020, or like late spring, early summer. And then we went public in April of 2021. So it was probably just short of a year. Now, again, I don't want to say that it was starting from scratch.
Sure, right.
But a lot of the legal things you can do, in the last year. I think I was kind of recently polling of some law firms, and in an ideal world, you're 12 to 18 months is when you're kind of like starting. Can you do it on a shorter time period? You can. It's just there's a little bit more stress on the system.
Yeah, right. Interesting. And so the preparedness process, is that driven primarily by, on the legal side of things, is that driven primarily by your outside counsel partners, and they have schedules that they typically follow for these things, and they see where the company fits within their templated schedules? How did that work?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that question.
In terms of the schedule for the legal process of the IPO preparedness piece, is that, does your outside counsel law firm have a templated outline that they follow, that they then apply to UiPath? Are they driving the process, or is that process, the legal process, that driven from your internal stakeholders? How do you chart the course, I should say?
I think it probably varies by company. Certainly the law firms, they've got their, tried and true methods that they just kind of want to dust off and redo. So now there might have been some internal planning at some of the other companies, I've been at or I'm at, we've done some kind of, what a 3-year roadmap looks like. Were we to go public, what's the cadence? But yeah, the law firm might have their own template and checklists and off-the-shelf policies. Obviously, not everything needs to be, drafted from scratch, especially if they've been there and done that. And so it's collaborative. Certainly, at the end of the day, it's your company, it's your IPO. And so if something's being proposed that's inconsistent with how you want to operate, then obviously there's give and take. And again, I think a lot of it depends on how big is your legal team? Like, what do you already have in place? Like, there's no one size fits all.
Right. So as you're progressing from UiPath to Secure and now PatSnap, how did your role change from those three employers?
So UiPath, I think with each role, I gained a little bit more responsibility, even more and more visibility and day-to-day interaction with the board members, with the C-suite. I've become more and more strategic. I've gotten a little bit more involved, again, in more of your traditional corporate related activities. So when I started, if you did like a pie chart, it was pretty heavy, like a Danone at the beginning on labor and employment and maybe a little litigation. And then you added sales to it. And then you added corporate governance and compliance. And then slowly, some M&A. And then when I went to UiPath, a little bit more M&A, a little bit more data privacy, a little bit more compliance, and then IPO. And then when I went to Secure, even more M&A and a little bit more financing, a little bit more, the line of credit, and more, biometrics and other. And then now at PatSnap, it's continued. on that path. I'm even, higher up, involved, more strategic level. I've gotten more involved in IP and what's an IP
Yeah.
strategy look like, and what is our portfolio, where I may not have done that at my prior stops. And so I think for in-house counsel, depending on what you want, some people are perfectly content in, this is my area of expertise. I'm going to be in a larger company, and this is what I'm going to do. And it might
Hmm.
be, but it might be at a global scale, and that could be tremendously fulfilling. Some people like to have their hands in a lot of different things, but you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable, because you're going to do things you have never done before, and you just learn on the fly. And I'll use an example. Prior to joining UiPath, I had not been involved in equity, and suddenly I was. And so
Yeah.
understanding the
Yeah.
components of the plan, why, the different types of equity, what
Yeah.
what are secondary sales, what are the tax implications, what do you have to do you're in 40 countries, how can you do this? In some countries you have to register with certain authorities. In China
Yeah.
there's a safe registration. So um, it's like a long-winded answer, that you have to be kind of comfortable doing things again and learning and developing. And once you've done it enough, now you're an expert in that space, and you move on to the next thing, and also knowing what you don't know. And in that case, whether it's learning by engaging outside counsel or through your peers. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of different paths one can take, and you know, there's no right approach. I think the hard part is, for me, getting that first in-house job was the hardest, because a lot of companies want someone with in-house experience. But how can you get in-house experience if no one gives you in-house experience?
Yeah.
And, and it was kind of similar, with joining PatSnap as the GC. Companies might have been looking for someone who had previously served as a GC. Someone's got to take that leap of faith and give you that first opportunity.
Right, right. I was gonna ask you about the privacy piece of your experience, but it's also, I think, related to the equity piece that you just described. When you're learning something new, how much have you found, or what strategies have you used to lean on outside counsel as opposed to, kind of becoming self-taught? What's your experience been there, and what strategies have you used that have been effective?
So again, I think it depends on the subject matter. I'm very cognizant of legal spend, and so I really, where I can, at least the places I've been in, have tried to be mindful as to when we go to external counsel and when we
Yeah,
don't.
yeah,
Because also it's hard. A lot of times, external counsel, they don't know the business, and so a lot of times, and this isn't a knock on law firms, but they're not necessarily. If I'm going to a law firm, I want them to tell me what to do. I don't want to necessarily, well, you can do this, and here are the potential pros, and here you can do this, and here are the potential ramifications. We want
yeah,
guidance as to what to do. Sometimes external counsel are reluctant to put themselves out there, because if something goes sideways, they don't want to be exposed. But they need to
yeah,
understand that their purpose is to be a security blanket for the in-house counsel. So if things do go sideways, the in-house counsel can say, "That's what I was told,"
yeah,
by the
yeah,
experts in this space. But I think it's been a combination. So certainly, like M&A, looking at the transaction documents, that's all originating from external counsel. And so that's more learning, working closely with them. Whereas other areas, I might learn through my own research, or speaking with other people, or seeking training on, or attending a CLE.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
think it depends.
Yeah, and I'd imagine, have you had a chance to work closely with outside counsel partners to, um, for the outside counsel partner to kind of really do most of the work at the outset, and then slowly that transitions to you as in-house counsel as you learn from them. Have you had any experiences with that kind of a process?
Yes. I think some of that's probably like due diligence in the beginning.
Yeah,
There might be a
yeah,
little bit more involvement from external counsel, and I think over time that could move more in-house. I think certainly preparing a lot of your contractual templates when you're a small legal team and you're just getting started and ramping up, you might ask for legal counsel to put together that first draft, and then over time you revise it internally. So it's a little
Yeah.
bit more purposeful for your business. Trying to think, and again, part of it is the more, over time, theoretically, you can hire more people who might have particular expertise. So if I'm a party of one and I'm going to external for counsel for data privacy issues, if down the road, if I hire someone who's does data privacy, I bring it in-house. If
Right.
I'm working with external counsel to manage our, the patent portfolio, if suddenly you have an IP attorney in-house, you pull it in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And we'll start wrapping up with, your experience at PatSnap, and I want to talk a little bit about your exposure to the IP piece. What have you used outside counsel for, or what have you learned through the process was this your first real exposure in depth to managing an IP portfolio, and how have you gotten your feet under you in that respect?
it is, and I wouldn't. I was my kind of first foray into kind of the IP space was really probably at UiPath, and we had an IP professional, but working with him to kind of put in place like an IP capture program to encourage employees to come forward with those innovations. What's the process? How can they be rewarded and recognized if we ultimately file for a patent, et cetera? I think at UiPath, one, its company is based on gathering all the publicly available patent data in the world in one spot. And so right out of the gate, just by learning about our products, gave me more knowledge and insight about the patent process. Kind of freedom to operate, what prior art is, and how do you protect it, and getting a little bit more knowledge about the litigation landscape and dealing with patent trolls, and then, in the case of PatSnap, a lot of our kind of portfolio, at least for patents, had been managed by some of my colleagues in the East. And so working with them just to get an understanding of, well, what do we have? What are our current processes? Conducting an audit just to understand if there's any gaps. And, where are we filing? Is that in line strategically? Does that make sense from a tax perspective? Separate and apart, I was getting involved. We wanted to register a number of trademarks. And so again, working both internally and with external counsel, like what makes sense? Where should we file based on our revenue in a particular countries? Which trademarks are we still using? In some instances, you file and then someone, a third party raises their hand, and then it's a matter of, maybe entering into a coexistence agreement. So I would say of all the different areas, that's been probably the biggest learning for me at PatSnap compared to the other
Eric,
areas.
can you talk a little bit about the business at PatSnap? I know you provided kind of high level overview at the start of the episode. Talk a bit about kind of where you are in the market, what customers come to you to do.
Sure. So, we're in excess of 100 million ARR business, have over 10,000 customers all over the world. It's industry agnostic. So if you're any company that creates something that it wants to eventually take to market, it could be big pharma with a new drug. It could be the automobile industry. It could be a sneaker company. It could be a government entity. So anyone that's you would license our product, and we have a host of different tools, some of which might be more targeted for like a life science, where you can really drill down into like a molecular level. You can use it in a host of ways. One is for information gathering, just to read up on literature about other patents and innovation, which might guide you. You can use our platform to understand the current patent landscape. And so you understand where there's white space that you can operate and innovate something that one day you could commercialize and you won't be infringing on a third party's IP. You can use it to get a ballpark valuation of what a
Yeah.
particular patent is. You can understand
Interesting.
of existing patents. When were they filed? When do they expire? What litigation is pending? You can use it to gather competitive intelligence to understand what are other companies investing in, because that
Yeah.
could guide where we want to move our business. You can also use it to ideate. And so through our AI functionality, it can help generate some ideas based on your kind of what search terms you're using, your queries, your keywords, that might give you an idea of something that you can then take that idea and decide what can we do with this? Is this something worth investing in? And if we do, could we commercialize it? And so it has a lot of utility. Again, any company with an R&D function, IP professionals, as well as patent attorneys who are supporting those very companies.
Got it. And so what's on the horizon for you or the legal function at PatSnap? What's top of mind for you? When it comes to kind of building the legal function there.
Yeah, so one is obviously making sure that we're meeting the needs of the business in all the areas. And so we've spent a lot of time really cultivating a strong relationship with the commercial team so that we can negotiate contracts more quickly, reduce friction both internally and with customers while still protecting the business. There's right now, we have a very strong presence in Asia as well as other parts of the world. For us, we have a significant number of customers in the US, but that's still like an emerging market for us. And so we have this tremendous opportunity to really grow the business in the West and especially at the enterprise level. So it's a lot more focus on, again, increasing not only the number of customers, but the types of customers and the volume of the particular deals.
Yeah.
Helping the business kind of mature the right way, whether it's from again, a commercial perspective, from a compliance perspective, from a data privacy and security perspective. So we've been building out like the security function. We're taking, the IT function. Where is our data flowing? How can we best address non-contractual questions from customers to give them peace of mind that what information will we see, what we won't, who owns what, how is it protected, where is it stored, what are the access, ensuring that we're minimizing risk of litigation. So we're really working closely cross-functionally with the company to really grow as like a one team approach globally.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and on all these episodes we end with what advice you would give to a rising attorney, someone who would like to be in your place at some point. What have you learned going, and what would you have liked to have heard when you were starting out your career?
So I think a few things. One is be open to possibilities. I think a lot of times you come in, whether it's as a lawyer or any field, you kind of have your, 3, 5, 10-year plan. Like by this such and such a date, I want to be a partner. I want to be in-house. Or I want to be in-house in a particular industry. And so, which is great, and it's certainly something I did. But I think in the course of doing that, you sometimes have blinders on, and so you somewhat limit yourself for other things that you don't even know that may be of interest. And so, for example, when I started out, I may have had a desire to go in-house in a particular field. And I pursued it very hard, and it can be frustrating and you might get close calls. But ultimately, once I opened myself up to other possibilities, I very quickly got my job at Danone. Now, it's not like I woke up and said, you know what, I want to be a lawyer at a yogurt company one day or a bottle of water. I didn't, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of different areas of the law and compliance and regulatory. And so understanding, no matter what company or what industry, there's still a lot of commonality. I think think about what type of life do you want? What type of, not only in work, do you want to be a generalist, or do you want to work in one particular area? Because I think that guides you in what type of company you'll go to work for.
Yeah.
What type of work-life balance do you want?
Yeah.
Do you like to travel? Do you not? Some companies, in order to climb the chain, you need to be open to take an international assignment. Is that something of interest to you? So I think it's, on the one hand, be open, but also be thoughtful. I think also think about what types of, and you may not know this until you do it, what work environments do you like? What cultures do you like?
Yeah.
And I think that the biggest thing I would say for lawyers, which is a hard thing to tell lawyers, is don't be afraid of taking risks.
Yeah.
Which is somewhat inconsistent with our inherent
What we do.
personality.
Yeah.
Right. But it's very easy to, let's say, stay on a particular path. It's comfortable. You know what the paycheck will be. You know what the path is.
Yeah.
And it can be scary to, you go in-house, you take a pay cut. You're doing things again for the first time with no support. Like and you learn on the fly. And so you have to be kind of open to that. And
Yeah.
also sometimes it'll work out, sometimes it won't. And
Yeah.
so, but every opportunity I've had, I've been able to build on my prior experience with the hope that I'm becoming better and more well-rounded in what I do. And hopefully it serves my companies well and will serve me well going forward.
But it's been really interesting to hear your path. Yeah, you practice what you preach for sure, and I appreciate you coming on and telling us about your experience. I'm sure those out there have a lot to take from this episode. So thank you for your time, and we'll be following you at PatSnap. Wish you all the best.
Great. Thank you for your time.